So Jackson County SART is a nonprofit, and we provide services to sexual assault survivors. We have direct services, acute care, so within 7 days of a sexual assault you can go to the hospital and completely free exam that includes medical care and forensic evidence collection. We run free support groups for adult women, for teens, for LGBTQ folk, for male survivors, and those are weekly free groups. We have Erin, a resource specialist, and this is a really important wraparound care aspect of what we do. Erin's entire job is to connect sexual assault survivors to resources that they need, and that can be anything from counseling, follow-up medical care, help with housing issues, help with crime victims compensation, things like that. And then a large part of what we do is prevention work. So we have classes kindergarten through 12th grade in Jackson County schools. Every year we go in and we have a curriculum of sexual violence prevention that builds year to year to year. And it's not focusing really on risk reduction. It's really looking at what are the aspects of our culture that support this level of sexual violence in our community, and how can we address that in primary prevention, and how can we teach kids to be the agents of change for their own community, and engage in behaviors that will slowly start to lower the levels of sexual violence we see in our community.
And tell us a little bit about your job, Erin, because so many people are just so blown away by the level of care and connection and support that you bring, that it's nice for you to join us too.
So I'm a resource specialist with Jackson County SART, and my role is to help anybody that's been affected by sexual violence, either a recent assault or history, it could be in the past, to help the healing process be a lot smoother and hopefully a bit easier. So I can find therapists for folks, help with transportation if needed. Pretty much I can do the footwork and the legwork and make the phone calls for people that are pretty much looking for anything on their path to healing. Doesn't mean I can always find it, but I will always make the effort to look for it.
Yeah, and for example, if somebody knows that they're interested in exploring counseling, there's a lot to finding a counselor, right? You need to think about, do you have insurance? Do you have transportation? Do you want to, what gender therapist? Do you certain styles of therapy? All of those things. And then also, a lot of counselors aren't taking new patients at any given time. So Erin can get that basic information and then make the phone calls and find out who fits the criteria and also is accepting new clients. We also have some Department of Justice funding that can help fund some of these services. And then the other thing is that Erin's building relationships with service providers in our community. So we can steer folks towards providers that we know are trauma informed, that we know have special skill set in serving folks who've experienced sexual violence, who we know, are safe places for LGBTQ survivors, things like that. So it takes a lot of the kind of question mark out of finding these services, and she can really do that work to connect a specific person with a specific service to answer their specific need.
Great. And a few years ago at the art fundraiser, you said something that really stayed with me, and you were talking about how maybe in the past sexual prevention meant having a friend with you and making sure nothing was put in the drink, and that all
the
of
risk
this
reduction.
Yeah, the risk reduction piece. And but then you said something that really touched me. You said, but you didn't realize that. You said prevention is culture change. Mm-hmm. So how do you see that as like the culture change? What does that mean to you, and what would you see like a super trauma informed culture looking like?
Yeah. So the level of sexual violence that exists right now is staggering, right? 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys will experience sexual violence before they turn 18. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 33 men will experience sexual violence as adults. That's huge numbers, right? And yet as a society, we are at this place where we sort of just accept that as the norm. It's almost like, okay, that's just how it is, right? And I hate the idea of going out there and saying those statistics and have the message be, that's just how it is, right? So primary prevention is saying, actually, sexual violence is preventable. And we have to figure out how. And the first step in figuring out how is asking the question, what is supporting this level of violence? And what I mean there is, what is allowing a culture to exist in which survivors are not always believed, and survivors have huge barriers to coming forward and asking for help, and at the same time offenders are not held accountable. And there's so much that goes into that. You know, a lot of it, those questions when somebody comes forward and says, I experienced a sexual assault, and the default questions are around, well, are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding? Maybe there was just confusion. You know, you were wearing that sexy outfit, maybe they thought you wanted it, kind of stuff. What we know about sexual violence is that it's perpetrated by a small number of mostly men, very intentionally, and they do it again and again and again, hundreds of times during their lifetime. It's an intentional act of harm towards other people. And so it's not, people aren't confused about whether it was or it wasn't, right? Offenders are intentional about harming others. And the way we react as a society is allowing them to get away with it. And so we really have to say, what can we change in our society? And so, you know, when we're working with kids from a very early age, part of that is, let's standardize the idea that the norm is consent, right? If we created a consent culture in which we knew that in all cases of sexual activity of anything, of any level, everybody understood you have to ask and get a yes, a clearly given, non-coerced yes, and then you can proceed. If that was our norm, it's not going to prevent offenders from harming other people, but it's going to make them stand out, right? We will know that, that it wasn't a confusion or a gray area. There is no gray area around consent. Right. You have a firm yes, or there's nothing. One of the things that I hear from folks a lot is, wow, the whole Me Too movement is probably making that a whole lot easier, to hold people accountable and for victims to come forward and feel believed. And that's a really interesting thing, because what we're seeing is, yes, it is easier to have conversations about sexual violence. And it is easier for people to feel comfortable and safe saying, yes, I had that experience as well. But what has not changed is the moment when somebody comes forward and says, this person in our community harmed me, they're still met with, there's no way that could have happened. I know that person, they would never do that. You must have done something to bring it on, or you must be confused. So the Me Too has allowed the discussion of sexual violence to happen in this sort of theoretical way more easily, but it has not changed the fact that when people come forward and say, so-and-so did this to me, they are still often met with disbelief, with, are you sure, with support for the offender. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really hard for society to understand that people in their community that they think are good, well-meaning people can actually have the capability of harming other people, and do it intentionally, and intentionally groom society to see them as people who would never do something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's a really hard thing to work on. And that's a change that we really have to bring out in understanding we don't know. We might think we know somebody, but we don't know what they are capable of. And if they hide that side of them, the offender side of them, from us, it doesn't mean that they're not offenders and that the victim is lying. It just means that they're really good at manipulating society.
Yeah.
Some of the culture change issues that we're looking at are really rooted in gender stereotypes that can be very strong in our culture. What men are supposed to be like, what women are supposed to be like. Conversations around gender still oftentimes leave out non-binary folks and transgender folks. And those are things that we need to change. because when, as a society, we say that men are supposed to be the ones who pursue in a romantic relationship, and when we normalize that coercion is romantic.
Mhm.
Exactly, like you see in a lot of romantic comedies, right, where it's about the pursuit and it's about, I just have to change this person's mind,
Right.
you know, and then we will fall in love and live happily ever
Right.
after. That's normalizing coercion.
Right.
That's normalizing that if somebody says, no, I'm not interested in you, all you have to do is keep trying and asking and
Following them.
manipulating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Stalking them.
Stalking, yes.
You know, it normalizes this idea. And so then when that behavior shows up from an offender, we're kind of hardwired by our society to say, oh,
They didn't mean it. It was a sweet gesture. It
Yeah.
wasn't meant to be harmful. It
Yeah.
wasn't, even though you were harmed, it wasn't meant to be, so it's okay. Yeah.
and you know, there's a lot of places in our society that link sexual activity with violence. You know, pornography is being viewed more often by adolescents and at younger ages. And we hear of kids who are learning how to have sex from watching porn because they're not getting that information in other safe, healthy ways, right? So they turn to porn, and porn notoriously links violence. And it is usually from the male gaze. It's usually for male gratification and shows women being submissive and enjoying things that in reality, you know, most or a lot of women do not enjoy, a lot of coercive behaviors. So that's another place we really have to look at, is what are the models of sexuality that our kids have access to, and how can we counter that with healthy, positive models of sexuality?
What would be your vision for the world around, like, sexual violence and sexual health, or, you know, how do you see what would be almost be the world that you would like to
The
live in
perfect
around that, in a
world.
perfect world? Or
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we start with removing barriers to folks who've experienced sexual violence, removing the barriers for them to come forward and say, this happened to me and I need help. For some survivors, they want to go through the legal process, and some survivors don't. But for everyone, there are barriers to saying, I'm a victim, right? I'm a survivor. And so if we had a society that said, I'm so sorry that happened, what can we do to help? Instead of the way that we treat victims and survivors now, you know, with the questioning and the why didn't you, and a lot of times that's out of fear, because we're afraid, wow, if it happened to this person, it could happen to me too. And so I'm trying to look for a way to somehow blame them, because it means then I can keep myself safe, if that makes sense. But if we could do away with all of that, blaming the survivor and making it hard, and just simply met them with open arms and said, how can we help you? I think we would like everybody to come from a trauma-informed approach, right? Understanding the effects that trauma has on somebody's whole life, and learning how to approach people with that in mind.
I'd really like to get rid of the idea of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, just keep going. I really love people to come to survivors with the question, what can I do to help? What is it that you need? It's not your fault. Of course, in my perfect world, there would be absolutely no sexual violence, and there is. And so I would really wish that the survivor didn't carry so much shame, and that people were there to support and to help and to educate themselves on sexual violence, and supporting people so that there's no more damage done other than what's already been done by sexual violence.
And I think if people understood offender behavior a little bit more, and the fact that these are intentional acts of violence, it's not about folks who are trying to get sex. You know, it's about harming someone else so that the offender feels better about themselves. And the minute sex is incorporated into an attack, an assault, it means that that survivor has all of those barriers to coming forward, right? Will be afraid to report, will be afraid that they won't be believed. So if we understood a little bit more how offenders are able to manipulate social norms to get away with it, maybe we could work on reducing those social norms, like the gender stereotyping, things like that. And we could also understand that we need to hold these folks accountable, right? Again, it's a few number of people doing a great amount of harm to others. And so if we understood how it is that they're perpetrating that harm and getting away with it, then we could start addressing that and reduce those levels of harm. I think also looking at how to teach healthy relationships and how to normalize healthy relationships, healthy communication, healthy sexuality, so that it's something that nobody ever feels afraid of talking about and asking about. I think that could really make it a healthier culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot.
There's a lot.
But we're starting, you know?
Yeah.
And just even having the conversation, how can I be involved in this movement? What can I do, what little piece can I do to forward the prevention of sexual violence, right? Because there is a lot that individuals can do, starting by seeing red flag behavior or seeing behavior that supports offenders rather than victims. One of the things that we want to make sure that people understand is that anybody who's experienced sexual violence or has a friend or family member who has, our entire job is to help folks navigate what comes next. All of our services are free, and we really just encourage people to start the conversation so that we can help them figure out what do they need help with. We want people to come forward and ask for the help that they need, and then we will do everything that we can to support them and provide them with the services. And if we can't provide it, there are many social service agencies in our community that we're partnering with who also have services that we can refer to. So we don't want people to feel alone in this journey. And we want folks to understand that however they're reacting to what has happened to them, we understand, and we will do everything that we can to help.
Now, that's where I feel very fortunate in my job as a resource specialist. When somebody calls me, we all know what it's like to have been through something hard and not want to pick up the phone and not make those phone calls and sit on hold or find what we need. And so my whole job is doing that. So of course I can just give a phone number to somebody, but I'm also happy to make the calls for them and do the footwork necessary to find what they're looking for.
Just navigating life after a trauma can be really, really difficult, right? And so our goal is to take as much of the hard work out of finding help, take that on so that the survivor can concentrate as much as possible on utilizing the resources that are found and on figuring out how to best heal.